The summer of 1944 saw the Eastern Front reshaped by a sequence of Soviet offensives that had broken through German defensive lines and driven the Wehrmacht back across hundreds of kilometers. Following Operation Bagration, which began on June 22nd and lasted until late August, Army Group Center was destroyed, with approximately 300,000 German troops killed, captured, or missing, and the entire central sector of the Eastern Front collapsing. In the north, Army Group North, under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, was left exposed along an extended front line, its supply routes running precariously through the Baltic states. By the end of July, Soviet forces of the First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagramyan and the Third Belarusian Front under General Ivan Chernyakhovsky had captured key cities including Daugavpils and Šiauliai, cutting the primary land routes connecting Army Group North to Army Group Center. By early August 1944, Army Group North's 16th and 18th Armies, comprising roughly 37,000 men, faced isolation in Latvia and Estonia. The nearest rail links to East Prussia, essential for resupply and reinforcements, were under threat as Soviet spearheads pushed toward the Baltic coast near Tukums and Riga. The Soviet objective, explicitly stated in Stavka, orders dated August 2nd, was to sever the German front entirely by reaching the Gulf of Riga, thereby trapping Army Group North in the Courland Peninsula and neutralizing it as a fighting force. Bagramyan's First Baltic Front alone fielded approximately 42,000 men, 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 2,500 aircraft, supported by significant artillery groupings exceeding 20,000 guns and mortars. German High Command, led by Adolf Hitler and the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, viewed the preservation of Army Group North as essential to maintaining a defensive perimeter in the Baltic and shielding East Prussia from Soviet invasion. Losing this region would not only open the path to Königsberg and Memel, but also compromise the Kriegsmarine's ability to operate in the Baltic Sea, affecting the evacuation of troops and materiel and the defense of German U-boat bases. To counter the Soviet advance, Hitler ordered a concentrated counterattack, Operation Doppelkopf, intended to re-establish a land corridor between Army Group North and the remnants of Army Group Center by retaking key positions around Šiauliai and reconnecting supply routes along the Baltic corridor. Planning began in early August, with the counterattack scheduled for mid-month. The operation was to be spearheaded by the 3rd Panzer Army under General Erhard Raus, supported by elements of the 39th Panzer Corps, and reinforced by 2 panzer divisions redeployed from Germany, the Elite Grossdeutschland Panzergrenadier Division and the 4th Panzer Division. These units brought with them approximately 200 operational tanks and assault guns, including Panther and Panzer IV models, though many crews had minimal time to acclimate to the terrain and coordinate with local units. Luftwaffe support was limited, but would include roughly 200 aircraft, primarily FW-190 fighter bombers and Ju-87 dive bombers, assigned to attack Soviet armor concentrations and disrupt their logistics. The operation stakes were underscored by both the scale of the Soviet advance and the precarious state of German forces. Army Group North, stretched across a 500-kilometer front, held positions with diminished artillery stocks, limited motorized transport, and fuel reserves reduced to less than 60% of operational requirements. Meanwhile, Soviet logistics, though strained by rapid advances, were bolstered by rail repair units and motorized columns ensuring steady flow of ammunition and reinforcements. The balance of manpower and materiel favored the Red Army, but German planners aimed to exploit their remaining armored reserves and tactical mobility to deliver a concentrated blow before Soviet defenses could consolidate along the Baltic corridor. On August 15, 1944, the first elements of the German 3rd Panzer Army initiated their counteroffensive along a sector stretching between Jelgava and Šiauliai. The primary objective in this opening phase was to cut through Soviet positions that had driven a wedge between Army Group North and Army Group Center, restoring direct overland contact and stabilizing the front along the Baltic corridor. The initial strike was carried out by the Grossdeutschland Panzergrenadier Division, with its Panzer Regiment fielding roughly 90 operational tanks, including Panther OSF, G, and Panzer IV-H models, and supported by approximately 120 armored personnel carriers and self-propelled guns. Alongside it advanced the 4th Panzer Division, deploying nearly 60 serviceable tanks, as well as Kampfgruppe formations drawn from infantry divisions of the 3rd Panzer Army, which together provided a combined strength of about 5,000 men in the assault sector. The German attack began at dawn, with a concentrated artillery bombardment targeting Soviet forward positions held by the 51st Army of the First Baltic Front. Approximately 600 guns and mortars, including heavy calibers up to 210 millimeters, opened fire in a coordinated 30-minute preparation designed to disrupt command posts and artillery batteries. Luftwaffe units, though reduced in strength, flew around 150 sorties on the first day, striking Soviet supply columns along the Šiauliai-Jelgava axis and targeting bridgeheads over the Venta River. Despite fuel shortages, the coordination between air and ground elements allowed the advancing Panzer spearheads to achieve local breakthroughs in the Soviet First Defensive Belt, capturing several villages, including Oats and parts of the Jelgava-Šiauliai rail line by late evening. Soviet forces reacted swiftly. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps, part of Bagram Yan's operational reserve, was redeployed toward the breach, bringing around 130 T-34-85 tanks and a significant complement of self-propelled artillery, including Su-85 and ISU-122 guns. These reinforcements reached the sector by August 16th, engaging the lead German elements in heavy clashes near Ruba and Vexal. The fighting over the next 48 hours was marked by repeated counterthrusts, as German units attempted to expand their penetration toward the coast, while Soviet forces sought to contain the advance and stabilize their rear area. Neither side achieved a decisive breakthrough in the opening phase, though German forces managed to push forward up to 20 kilometers along certain sectors, partially reopening a supply corridor between the two army groups, albeit under constant threat of Soviet interdiction. Command structures on both sides faced mounting challenges in the first days of Doppelkopf. For the Germans, General Raus coordinated the offensive from forward headquarters near Mitau, with support from General Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanding Army Group Center, whose remaining formations were expected to anchor the southern flank of the push. For the Soviets, General Bagram Yan personally oversaw the redirection of his mechanized reserves, while Stavka authorized additional air support from the 3rd Air Army to counter the Luftwaffe's renewed presence. Radio intercepts and reconnaissance revealed German attempts to concentrate additional armored battle groups from East Prussia, prompting Soviet commanders to accelerate fortification efforts along the approaches to Riga and to lay extensive minefields, particularly near Dobele and Jelgava. By August 17th, the first phase of the operation had set the stage for broader clashes along the Baltic corridor. German forces had secured limited territorial gains and temporarily alleviated the isolation of Army Group North. But Soviet reinforcements and the depth of their defenses made it clear that the counteroffensive would face escalating resistance. The initial momentum achieved by the Grossdeutschland and 4th Panzer divisions would soon be tested as Soviet countermeasures intensified, forcing the Germans to commit additional reserves and risking the depletion of their fuel and ammunition stocks in the days ahead. The strategic planning behind Operation Doppelkopf evolved rapidly as the opening assaults revealed the resilience of Soviet defenses and the need for deeper penetration to secure a stable land connection. German objectives extended beyond the limited reopening of supply routes. The High Command now aimed to push the front back towards Šiauliai and Tukums, ensuring a defensible corridor at least 40 kilometers wide that could withstand future Soviet counteroffensives. This expansion necessitated additional forces, and Hitler authorized the redeployment of elements from the 5th Panzer Division, along with a brigade of Tiger the Furnace heavy tanks from the 510th Heavy Panzer Battalion, which brought approximately 45 operational Tigers into the theater. Combined with existing armor, this increased the German armored strength to over 300 tanks and assault guns by August 18th, supported by nearly 1,000 troops concentrated along a 90-kilometer sector of the front. German logistical planning prioritized speed over sustainability. Supply depots in East Prussia, primarily in Tilsit and Königsberg, worked to deliver fuel, ammunition, and spare parts via rail to the frontline depots near Jelgava, but repeated Soviet airstrikes on railheads slowed deliveries. Available fuel stocks allowed for no more than 3 to 4 days of sustained armored operations, before rationing became critical. Ammunition allocations were similarly constrained, with each heavy artillery piece allotted around 150 rounds for the offensive, limiting prolonged bombardments. In contrast, Soviet supply lines, though stretched due to their rapid westward advance, were increasingly supported by newly repaired railway links from Daugavpils and Vilnius, allowing the First Baltic Front to rotate fresh divisions and replenish its tank corps despite losses in the opening clash. Doctrinal approaches diverged significantly. The Germans relied on rapid armored thrusts, utilizing combined arms, Kampfgruppen, to punch through specific points rather than conducting broad front advances. Reconnaissance battalions, equipped with SDCFZ, 234 armored cars and light Panzer II Luchs tanks, scouted Soviet positions and flanks to identify gaps. Luftwaffe support emphasized close air support and interdiction, though daily sortie rates rarely exceeded 200 due to shortages of aviation fuel and the presence of approximately 1,000 Soviet aircraft operating within range of the front. Soviet planning, guided by Bagramian, focused on attrition and containment. Defensive belts were organized in depth, with anti-tank ditches, minefields exceeding 2,000 mines across priority axes, and dense concentrations of 76 mm and 85 mm field guns covering likely approach routes. Propaganda accompanied the planning on both sides. German broadcasts framed Doppelkopf as a decisive action to rescue comrades in the north and protect the gateway to East Prussia, aiming to maintain morale among troops and the civilian population facing advancing Soviet forces. Soviet communications, meanwhile, emphasized the impending collapse of German positions and the inevitability of cutting off Army Group North, using the momentum from Operation Bagration as proof of continued Red Army superiority. These narratives contributed to high morale among Soviet troops and a sense of urgency among German formations tasked with halting the encirclement. Despite the meticulous German preparations, several miscalculations became apparent. Intelligence underestimated the speed at which Soviet mechanized reserves could be redeployed. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps and elements of the 5th Guards Tank Army were already moving into blocking positions by August 18th, earlier than anticipated. Furthermore, German fuel reserves, already strained, faced additional pressure as Soviet artillery and air attacks disrupted forward supply dumps, destroying several convoys near Dobele. Communication between the 3rd Panzer Army and Army Group North also proved inconsistent, with delays in transmitting orders and coordinating supporting attacks along secondary axes, limiting the cohesion of the overall offensive effort. By the close of August 18th, both sides had finalized their plans for the next stage. German forces prepared to commit their heavy armor, including the Tiger battalions, in concentrated thrusts designed to break through to the Gulf of Riga, while Soviet commanders reinforced their defensive echelons with anti-tank artillery and prepared counterattack groups equipped with new IS-2 heavy tanks. The stage was set for the first major clashes that would determine whether Doppelkopf could achieve its operational aims or be blunted before the corridor could be secured. The first significant engagements of Operation Doppelkopf unfolded between August 19th and 24, 1944, as German armored formations launched their concentrated thrusts against Soviet positions along the Jelgava-Šiauliai axis and toward Tukums. The Grossdeutschland Division spearheaded the central advance, supported on its flanks by the 4th Panzer Division and elements of the 5th Panzer Division, while the 510th Heavy Panzer Battalion's Tiger Wine tanks were committed as shock units against fortified sectors. In total, nearly 150 German tanks and assault guns advanced on a 25-kilometer frontage, backed by approximately 600 artillery pieces and mortars delivering rolling barrages. The initial breakthroughs were achieved against positions held by the Soviet 43rd Army, whose forward regiments suffered heavy disruption under the concentrated artillery fire and close-range attacks by Stuka dive bombers and FW-190 fighter bombers, which flew over 120 sorties during the first. By the evening of August 19th, German spearheads had penetrated the first two Soviet defensive belts near Doppelkopf, advancing up to 15 kilometers and seizing key road junctions critical for resupply and maneuver. The village of John Peels was captured after a 4-hour battle that saw the destruction of more than 20 Soviet T-34-85 tanks by Tiger crews, with German armor losing 11 vehicles in return, primarily to concealed 85mm anti-tank guns and mines. Despite these gains, Soviet command rapidly redeployed the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, which counterattacked along the Vexal-Dobele line on August 20th with around 110 T-34-85s, supported by ISU-122 assault guns and infantry brigades numbering over 8,000 troops. These counterattacks stalled German momentum, forcing the panzer divisions into a series of defensive engagements to hold their gains while awaiting fuel and ammunition resupply. The fighting had an immediate impact on civilian populations in the contested areas. Villages along the advance routes, including Dobele, Ruba, and Jaunpils, were evacuated under chaotic conditions as both sides requisitioned livestock, carts, and shelter for their troops. Roads became congested with fleeing civilians and military convoys, complicating supply movements. Local infrastructure, such as the Jelgava-Šiauliai rail line, became a focal point of the clashes, changing hands twice between August 19th and 21, as Soviet demolition teams attempted to render it inoperable while German engineers worked simultaneously to restore sections for armored train resupply. Morale fluctuated on both sides as the engagements intensified. German troops experienced a temporary boost following the capture of Dobele and the partial reopening of contact with Army Group North. But logistical shortfalls soon dampened their momentum. Fuel shortages were particularly acute, with panzer formations often immobilized for hours as supply convoys, vulnerable to Soviet artillery and airstrikes, struggled to reach forward units. Soviet morale, bolstered by their numerical superiority and the strategic momentum from prior offensives, was tempered by the heavy losses inflicted by concentrated German armor and the challenges of countering the Tiger tanks, whose frontal armor proved resistant to most Soviet 76mm guns at standard engagement ranges. Unexpected developments marked this stage of the operation. On August 21st, elements of the German 39th Panzer Corps executed a surprise flanking maneuver south of Tukums, exploiting a gap between Soviet rifle divisions stretched thin to cover the coastal approaches. This maneuver resulted in a temporary corridor extending to the Gulf of Raga, a vital lifeline for Army Group North's logistical and evacuation routes. However, the corridor was only 10 to 15 kilometers wide and remained under continuous Soviet artillery and air observation, making its long-term viability uncertain. By the conclusion of August 21st, both sides had incurred substantial losses. German armored units reported the destruction or disabling of approximately 60 tanks and assault guns, while Soviet records indicated over 150 armored vehicles lost during counterattacks and defensive actions. Casualties on both sides were significant, with German losses exceeding 5,000 killed, wounded, or missing, and Soviet figures estimated at over 12,000, including 3,500 captured during local German advances. These battles underscored the ferocity of the fighting and set the conditions for the next phase, as Soviet High Command prepared to commit additional reserves to seal the corridor and prevent the Germans from consolidating their tenuous connection to Army Group North. Between August 22 and 25, 1944, the conflict along the Baltic corridor intensified, as both sides escalated their efforts to either secure or sever the tenuous link between Army Group North and the rest of the German front. German command committed the last of its available reserves, including the 12th Panzer Division, recently refitted and transferred from Denmark, which brought roughly 70 operational Panzer IV and Stu-G assault guns to reinforce the line. These units, along with the depleted Grossdeutschland and 4th Panzer Divisions, sought to expand the corridor to a defensible width of at least 30 kilometers, establishing control over vital junctions around Tukums, and preventing Soviet forces from cutting the link through concentrated strikes. The Soviet response was immediate and forceful. Stavka, recognizing the threat posed by the reopening of the corridor, ordered Bagramian's 1st Baltic Front and Hovhannes Bagramian's subordinate tank corps to focus their counter-offensive efforts on narrowing the gap. Reinforcements arrived from the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps, equipped with around 180 tanks and self-propelled guns, including IS-2 heavy tanks and Su-100 tank destroyers, whose 122mm and 100mm guns posed a greater threat to German heavy armor. Soviet artillery strength in the sector was increased to over 1,200 guns and mortars, allowing for continuous bombardment of German-held positions along the John Pils-Tukums line. The fighting during this period was marked by attritional clashes, with neither side able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. German forces, limited by dwindling fuel stocks, often had to conduct short, localized attacks to seize advantageous terrain before pulling back to defensive positions. By August 23rd, many panzer formations were operating at less than 50% of their initial strength, with several battalions reduced to under a dozen serviceable tanks. Luftwaffe units attempted to compensate by flying concentrated ground attack missions, averaging 180 sorties per day. But the presence of over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, including Yak-9 fighters and Il-2 Sturmovik bombers, ensured German air superiority remained elusive. Weather and terrain further complicated operations. Heavy rains on August 24th turned key roads near Dobele and Tukums into mud, slowing both armored advances and supply convoys. River crossings, particularly over the Lia Lupi and Venta, became choke points targeted by Soviet artillery and airstrikes. German engineers constructed makeshift pontoon bridges to maintain mobility, but repeated destruction by Soviet forces caused delays and further strained the already fragile supply lines. Soviet forces, though advancing from prepared positions, also struggled with mud and logistical congestion, as their rear areas became overstretched from the rapid pace of redeployments since the start of the Baltic offensive. Political tensions added pressure to the battlefield situation. German high command faced constant directives from Hitler to maintain the corridor at any cost, with orders forbidding any voluntary withdrawal from the newly gained positions, despite heavy casualties. For the Soviets, success in closing the gap carried strategic and symbolic weight, as sealing Army Group North in the Courland region would not only weaken the German position in the Baltic, but also free Soviet forces for operations toward East Prussia. Reports from the Soviet First Baltic Front indicated that Stavka intended to launch a renewed offensive with fresh rifle divisions by the end of August, aiming to cut the corridor before the Germans could fortify it into a sustainable line. Casualties during this escalation phase continued to mount. By August 25th, German losses since the start of Operation Doppelkopf had risen to approximately 12,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with around 120 tanks and assault guns destroyed or disabled. Soviet casualties over the same period exceeded 2,000, including nearly 300 tanks and self-propelled guns lost in counterattacks and defensive operations. The destruction and disruption extended beyond the battlefield, as rail lines near Jelgava and Tukums were rendered unusable by repeated artillery duels, further hindering both sides' logistical efforts. As August 25 drew to a close, the front lines remained fluid but increasingly exhausted. The German corridor persisted, now roughly 20 kilometers wide in its most stable sector, but it remained a precarious lifeline, constantly shelled and raided by Soviet aircraft and artillery. Both armies prepared for the climactic battles that would decide whether the corridor could hold or whether Army Group North would face complete isolation in the weeks to come. Between August 26th and 29th, 1944, the battles along the Baltic corridor reached their peak as both German and Soviet forces concentrated their strength in a struggle that would determine the fate of Army Group North. German High Command, under constant pressure from Hitler to hold the corridor at any cost, redeployed nearly all available mobile reserves to the Tukums-Jaunpils-Dobele axis. The combined force consisted of the remnants of the Großdeutschland, 4th, 5th, and 12th Panzer Divisions, supported by elements of the 14th and 21st Infantry Divisions, totaling roughly 9,000 men and close to 220 operational tanks and assault guns. These included the remaining Tiger-Liban heavy tanks of the 510th Battalion, whose numbers had dwindled to about 30 serviceable vehicles after weeks of fighting. Soviet command, aware that the Germans were committing their last operational reserves, launched large-scale assaults aimed at severing the corridor entirely. The 1st Baltic Front massed the 43rd and 51st Armies, reinforced by the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps and 2nd Guards Tank Corps, amassing nearly 15,000 troops, 400 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 1,500 artillery pieces and mortars along a 60-kilometer front. Air support was provided by the 3rd Air Army, which deployed roughly 900 aircraft, including PE-2 dive bombers and Il-2 Sturmovix, tasked with targeting German concentrations and supply depots. The fighting intensified around key road junctions and river crossings, particularly near Dobele and Jaunpils, where German forces established strong points to block Soviet advances. On August 27th, Soviet forces launched a series of coordinated attacks, supported by rolling artillery barrages exceeding 1,000 shells over a 24-hour period. German positions, including fortified villages and field entrenchments, were repeatedly overrun and recaptured as both sides rotated fresh units into the line. In one engagement near Jaunpils, German Tiger tanks destroyed 28 Soviet T-34-85s and IS-2s at ranges of 800 to 1,200 meters, while losing 6 Tigers to concentrated artillery fire and Su-100 tank destroyers. Air combat over the corridor was intense. The Luftwaffe, operating roughly 180 aircraft, attempted to disrupt Soviet supply lines and provide close air support, but losses mounted as they encountered superior numbers of Soviet fighters and heavy anti-aircraft fire near Soviet staging areas. On August 28th alone, German records noted the loss of 22 aircraft, while Soviet reports documented the destruction of 14 planes in air combat and by ground fire. Despite these efforts, German forces remained under constant Soviet aerial observation, which enabled precise targeting of their supply convoys and artillery positions. Civilian populations in the combat zone endured severe hardships. Villages such as Dobele, Lielos, and Jaunpils were largely depopulated, with remaining civilians pressed into labor, constructing defenses, or evacuating under constant artillery and air attacks. Infrastructure suffered extensive damage. Bridges over the Lielupe and Venta rivers were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, delaying German reinforcement and evacuation efforts. German medical facilities reported shortages of bandages, plasma, and morphine, with field hospitals treating over 1,000 wounded during the 4-day period, many evacuated by rail under threat of Soviet airstrikes. Strategic decisions during this phase reflected the High Command's desperation. Hitler personally intervened in operational planning, forbidding any withdrawal from the corridor, and ordering local counterattacks, even when fuel shortages made such movements difficult. Some panzer battalions operated with fewer than 10 tanks, often kept stationary to conserve fuel, and used as mobile defensive guns rather than maneuvering assets. Soviet commanders, meanwhile, prioritized encirclement tactics, probing for weaknesses in the German flanks near Tukums and Dobele, while maintaining constant frontal pressure to exhaust enemy reserves. By August 29th, both sides had suffered substantial losses without achieving a definitive breakthrough. German casualties since August 26 exceeded 8,000 killed, wounded, or missing, while around 70 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or disabled. Soviet forces lost over 15,000 troops, including more than 200 tanks and self-propelled guns, many to concentrated German anti-tank defenses and airstrikes. The corridor, though still open, was reduced to a fragile strip averaging 15 kilometers in width, heavily contested and subjected to near-continuous bombardment. The stage was set for the decisive engagements and potential turning point of Operation Doppelkopf as September approached and both armies faced mounting exhaustion and logistical collapse. From August 30 to September 2, 1844, German and Soviet forces shifted from offensive thrusts toward a combination of defensive adaptations and limited counterattacks as both sides grappled with the attrition and logistical crises brought by weeks of heavy combat. The corridor linking Army Group North with the rest of the German front had narrowed further, at points reduced to under 12 kilometers in width, particularly along the Jaunpils-Dobele stretch, where Soviet artillery concentrations and air reconnaissance made every movement hazardous. German units, depleted and low on fuel, began to rely increasingly on static defensive positions, reinforced with mines, anti-tank obstacles, and hastily constructed field fortifications rather than continuous armored maneuver. German command reorganized its surviving armored strength into smaller Kampfgruppen, each typically consisting of 10 to 15 tanks, infantry companies, and attached artillery designed to react to Soviet penetrations rather than initiate large-scale offensives. Fuel shortages forced many panzer units to adopt static firing roles, deploying Tigers and Panthers as fortified gun platforms at road junctions and choke points. The 4th Panzer Division, down to fewer than 20 operational tanks by September 1st, rotated its remaining armor between key defensive sectors, while the Grossdeutschland Division, heavily attrited, shifted many of its veteran grenadiers into anti-tank teams, equipped with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks. Soviet forces, though still numerically superior, also faced challenges that tempered their offensive tempo. Rapid redeployments over the preceding weeks had strained their logistics, and fuel and ammunition convoys struggled to reach forward positions due to the destruction of bridges over the Venta and Lea Loop rivers by German demolition teams and airstrikes. The 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps reported that by September 1st, over 30% of its T-34-85 tanks were non-operational due to mechanical breakdowns and shortages of spare parts. Soviet infantry divisions, many of which had advanced hundreds of kilometers since June, suffered from fatigue and reduced combat strength, with regiments often operating at 50 to 60% of their authorized manpower. Both sides adapted their tactics to the evolving conditions. German forces prioritized the construction of layered defenses, supported by concentrated artillery fire and night raids to disrupt Soviet forward positions. Small-scale counterattacks were launched, often by battalion-sized forces, to retake lost trenches or disrupt Soviet artillery lines, but these were limited by fuel and manpower constraints. Soviet units, recognizing the difficulty of breaching the corridor through direct assaults alone, expanded their use of night infiltration tactics and intensified artillery preparation, expending over 15,000 shells between August 30th and September 2nd to wear down German defenses before committing armor. Partisan activity behind German lines further complicated their situation. Soviet-backed partisan groups operating in Latvia and Lithuania sabotaged rail lines leading to Jelgava and Tilsit, derailing supply trains and destroying locomotives, which contributed to critical shortages of ammunition and food for frontline troops. German security divisions were forced to divert several battalions to guard supply routes, reducing the number of troops available for the main defensive effort along the corridor. Psychological strain became increasingly evident on both sides. German soldiers, aware of the precariousness of their position and the impossibility of significant reinforcements, relied heavily on discipline and defensive cohesion to maintain their lines. Reports from the 3rd Panzer Army indicated rising desertion rates among replacement battalions, particularly those composed of hastily trained recruits sent from occupied territories. Soviet troops, though buoyed by the strategic situation, also faced morale issues due to repeated failed attempts to completely sever the corridor and the mounting casualty lists from attacks against entrenched German positions. By September 2nd, The operational tempo had slowed, but the strategic stakes remained unchanged. The corridor persisted as a fragile lifeline, averaging 12 to 15 kilometers in width and heavily fortified by German engineers, while Soviet forces continued to press along its flanks and probe for vulnerabilities. Both armies prepared for renewed action, with the Soviets planning another concentrated offensive to finally close the link, and the Germans reinforcing key sectors with whatever reserves remained. The fighting was poised to shift toward a critical decision point, as one final push or collapse would determine whether Army Group North would remain connected or face complete isolation in the coming weeks. From September 3 to 5, 1944, the battle for the Baltic Corridor entered a decisive phase as Soviet forces launched a coordinated offensive designed to finally sever Army Group North from Army Group Center, while German units fought to prevent a collapse with their remaining operational strength. Stavka directed the 43rd and 51st Armies, supported by the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps and 2nd Guards Tank Corps, to deliver converging strikes from the east and south toward the corridor's narrowest point near John Pills. Combined, these formations fielded approximately 13,000 troops, nearly 350 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 1,800 artillery pieces, with the 3rd Air Army committing around 1,000 aircraft for close support and interdiction missions. Soviet artillery preparation on September 3rd alone involved more than 8,000 shells and rockets, targeting German strongpoints, supply depots, and suspected command posts across a 25-kilometer sector. The German defense, though heavily attrited, was anchored by well-prepared positions manned by approximately 7,000 troops from the Großdeutschland, 4th, 5th, and 12th Panzer Divisions, alongside infantry divisions and rear area security units pressed into frontline service. Only about 140 tanks and assault guns remained operational, including 18 Tiger Viper heavy tanks, and a limited number of Panthers, most concentrated near road junctions at Dobele and John Pills. Artillery support was limited to around 500 guns and mortars, many firing reduced allotments of ammunition due to strained supply lines. Luftwaffe presence was minimal, with fewer than 120 aircraft available, largely focused on reconnaissance and defensive sorties rather than offensive operations. The Soviet offensive began in the early morning hours of September 3rd, with a rolling barrage followed by infantry assaults and armored spearheads pushing toward the corridor's central sector. The initial shock achieved several penetrations, particularly south of John Pills, where Soviet rifle divisions advanced up to 5 kilometers, overrunning German outposts and capturing several artillery batteries. However, German reserves counterattacked in the afternoon, deploying Tigers and Panthers from the 510th Heavy Panzer Battalion in a series of localized counterstrikes. Near the village of Seam, 8 Tigers destroyed over 20 T-34-85s and IS-2s during a 2-hour engagement, temporarily halting the Soviet thrust, and allowing German engineers to lay additional minefields along the threatened axis. Despite these tactical successes, German forces faced mounting pressure as Soviet attacks continued without pause. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps exploited gaps along the corridor's southern edge on September 4th, advancing to within 10 kilometers of the Gulf of Riga and threatening to sever the German supply route entirely. Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix and PE-2 bombers, flying over 300 sorties per day, concentrated on destroying bridges, ammunition dumps, and convoys, further isolating forward German units. German supply convoys, often traveling at night to avoid detection, still suffered heavy losses, with over 40 trucks destroyed by air attacks and artillery during this 3-day period. The civilian toll increased as combat zones expanded. Thousands of Latvian civilians were displaced as villages such as Sam, Lestan, and Lielos were shelled and burned during the Soviet advance or demolished by German rearguard actions to deny shelter to Soviet forces. Evacuations toward Riga and Tukums overwhelmed local rail stations, where trains prioritized military cargo, leaving many civilians stranded or forced to march on foot under shell fire. The fighting culminated on September 5th, when Soviet forces launched a concentrated night assault, supported by searchlights and heavy artillery fire, aimed at collapsing the corridor near Dobele. German defenders, reinforced by the last operational tanks from the 4th Panzer Division and elements of the 21st Infantry Division, managed to repel the attack after a 9-hour engagement, inflicting significant losses on Soviet infantry while suffering over 2,500 casualties themselves. Soviet reports documented the loss of nearly 100 tanks and self-propelled guns during the 3-day offensive, with total personnel casualties estimated at over 15,000. Although the corridor remained open at the conclusion of September 5th, it had been reduced to an average width of just 8 to 12 kilometers and was under constant Soviet artillery and air observation. German units had prevented its immediate collapse, but at the cost of their last operational reserves, while Soviet forces prepared for renewed attacks designed to either close the link permanently or force the Germans into a fighting withdrawal toward the Courland Peninsula. The outcome of these battles would decide the operational fate of Army Group North in the weeks that followed. From September 6 to 9, 1944, the final major engagements of Operation Doppelkopf unfolded as Soviet forces intensified their attempts to sever the corridor completely, while German forces, nearly exhausted of reserves and supplies, struggled to maintain a viable route for Army Group North. The corridor, now constricted to as little as 7 kilometers in width along some stretches near Jaunpils and Dobele, became a target for relentless Soviet artillery barrages and armored thrusts. Stavka ordered the 43rd and 51st Armies, supported by the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps, to deliver one last concentrated offensive aimed at reaching the Gulf of Riga, north of Tukums, cutting the Germans off and trapping nearly 37,000 men of Army Group North in Latvia. The Soviet assault force totaled around 12,000 troops, 320 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 1,600 artillery pieces, with continuous air support from roughly 800 aircraft of the 3rd Air Army. Daily artillery expenditure exceeded 7,000 shells, with barrages directed at German strongpoints, supply routes, and defensive choke points. Soviet spearheads, including IS-2 heavy tanks and Su-100 tank destroyers, pressed against German flanks on September 7th, capturing several villages south of Tukums and advancing to within 6 kilometers of the Baltic coast, creating the most significant threat yet to the corridor's integrity. German forces, numbering roughly 6,000 combat-effective troops, with fewer than 120 operational tanks and assault guns, deployed their remaining strength to hold key junctions at Dobele and along the Lestene-Same line. The 510th Heavy Panzer Battalion, now reduced to 12 serviceable Tiger the Line tanks, anchored defensive positions, supported by makeshift Kampfgruppen, composed of remnants from the Großdeutschland, 4th and 12th Panzer Divisions, as well as hastily mobilized rear area troops. Artillery support was limited to approximately 400 guns and mortars, many firing reduced loads due to critical ammunition shortages. Luftwaffe participation dwindled further, with fewer than 100 aircraft flying defensive sorties, primarily during night hours to avoid Soviet fighter patrols. On September 7th, the Soviets launched their most concentrated thrust toward Tukums, committing over 150 tanks in a two-pronged assault along the coastal road and through the forests north of Dobele. The attack initially forced back German infantry and captured several crossroads, but a counterattack led by 8 Tigers and a handful of Panthers at Seam stalled the advance. In a 3-hour battle, German heavy armor destroyed at least 23 Soviet tanks, while losing 4 of their own to ISU-152 fire and concentrated artillery strikes. The counterattack bought time for German engineers to fortify positions along a secondary defensive line closer to Tukums. Despite tactical successes, the German situation became increasingly untenable. Fuel and ammunition shortages crippled mobility and firepower, with many armored vehicles relegated to static defensive roles. Supply convoys faced near total interdiction by Soviet aircraft and partisans, forcing resupply by night and reducing daily deliveries by over 50% compared to late August levels. Infantry units, suffering from attrition and fatigue, often held sectors with companies reduced to 40 or 50 men, relying on minefields and prepared positions to compensate for their diminished. Civilian suffering reached a peak during this stage. Villages along the contested corridor, including Sem, Lestaine, and Dobele, were almost entirely destroyed, with remaining inhabitants evacuated toward Riga or left to survive in makeshift shelters. German forces conducted forced evacuations and demolitions to deny infrastructure to Soviet forces, while Soviet artillery and airstrikes caused widespread destruction in occupied areas. Casualty evacuation became a major challenge, with field hospitals overwhelmed. Many wounded German soldiers were evacuated by sea through Riga due to the vulnerability of land routes. By September 9th, the corridor remained open, but fragile, averaging only 7 to 10 kilometers in width and subject to constant Soviet shelling and air reconnaissance. German forces had prevented complete encirclement, but at the cost of nearly all operational reserves. Estimates placed German casualties for September 6th-9 at over 6,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with an additional 40 tanks and assault guns lost. Soviet losses were also significant, with over 12,000 personnel and roughly 150 armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. Both sides recognized that the corridor's long-term survival was improbable, and German command began preparing contingency plans for a staged withdrawal into the Courland Peninsula should Soviet attacks resume on the same scale in the coming days. By September 10, 1944, Operation Doppelkopf had reached its conclusion as both the German and Soviet commands reassessed their positions after nearly 4 weeks of continuous fighting. The German counteroffensive had temporarily re-established a land corridor connecting Army Group North with the remainder of the Wehrmacht, but the link was narrow, heavily contested, and unsustainable under prolonged Soviet pressure. On September 10th, the corridor's width varied between 7 and 12 kilometers, with every road and rail line under constant artillery and air observation. Army Group North, comprising around 37,000 troops across its 16th and 18th Armies, remained supplied and connected, but only through a fragile route that could not withstand another large-scale Soviet operation without major reinforcements, which the Oberkommando de Heer was unable to provide. In the days following the peak battles, German command, led by General Erhard Raus and Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, began consolidating forces along defensible positions closer to Riga and Tukums, preparing for the possibility of a full withdrawal into the Courland Peninsula. Reinforcement prospects were negligible. The 3rd Panzer Army, already exhausted and reduced to fewer than 100 operational tanks and assault guns, had no capacity for renewed offensive action. Luftwaffe support was similarly diminished, with fewer than 90 aircraft remaining in the sector, mostly tasked with reconnaissance and defensive interception rather than close support. Supply shortages deepened, with fuel deliveries falling to under 40% of daily requirements and ammunition rations reduced for all artillery calibers. The Soviet command, although achieving partial success in reducing the corridor and inflicting heavy casualties, had not accomplished Stavka's main objective of completely isolating Army Group North. The First Baltic Front, under General Bagramyan, had expended considerable resources during August and early September, suffering over 6,000 casualties, including more than 700 tanks and self-propelled guns lost since the start of August. Many rifle divisions were operating at under 60% of their authorized strength, and tank corps reported extensive mechanical attrition after weeks of high-tempo operations. Consequently, Stavka paused large-scale assaults after September 10th, ordering regrouping and reinforcement ahead of future offensives toward Riga and the Courland region. The immediate aftermath of Doppelkopf left the battlefield in a state of devastation. The contested areas around Dobele, Jaunpils, and Tukums were marked by destroyed infrastructure, abandoned vehicles, and depopulated villages. Rail lines between Jelgava and Šiauliai were rendered largely inoperative by repeated demolitions, while bridges over the Laialupe and Venta rivers remained temporary structures vulnerable to collapse. Civilian populations suffered mass displacement, with tens of thousands fleeing toward Riga or deeper into German-held Latvia, while others found themselves under Soviet control amid shortages of food, shelter, and medical supplies. German and Soviet casualty estimates highlight the intensity of the fighting. Between August 15 and September 10th, German forces suffered approximately 26,000 killed, wounded, or missing, and lost around 300 tanks and assault guns, as well as dozens of aircraft and artillery pieces. Soviet losses during the same period exceeded 6,000 personnel, with over 700 armored vehicles and hundreds of aircraft destroyed or damaged. While the German counteroffensive achieved its immediate operational goal of reconnecting Army Group North, it failed to establish a corridor that could withstand renewed Soviet attacks, effectively delaying but not preventing the strategic isolation of German forces in the Baltic. In the broader context of the Eastern Front, Operation Doppelkopf represented a temporary reprieve for the German position rather than a turning point. Within weeks, renewed Soviet offensives, the Baltic Offensive beginning in late September, would again push toward Riga, forcing the Germans into a fighting withdrawal and ultimately trapping Army Group North in the Courland Pocket by October. The operation, though tactically significant in demonstrating that the Wehrmacht could still mount coordinated counterattacks despite heavy losses, highlighted the growing disparity in manpower, material, and logistical capacity between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1944. Historically, Doppelkopf is viewed as one of the last operationally coordinated German counterstrikes on the Eastern Front that achieved a temporary strategic result without altering the overall course of the war. Its legacy lies in its demonstration of the Wehrmacht's capacity for concentrated armored warfare even in a defensive phase. The heavy cost in men and material paid for short-lived operational gains, and its role in delaying, but not averting, the eventual encirclement and isolation of Army Group North. The fighting around the Baltic Corridor underscored the relentless pressure of the Red Army's advances in the final year of the war, and foreshadowed the coming battles that would confine German forces to the Courland Pocket until the final surrender in May 1945.